Welcome to the AutoSys training video. By the end of this video, you will understand how to configure and enable SAML single sign-on or SSO authentication for AutoSys Web UI and REST web services. Organizations today operate multiple applications across their enterprise. Managing separate user credentials for each application creates significant challenges. Multiple passwords to remember, multiple password resets to manage, multiple audit trails to track. This fragmented credential landscape becomes a security vulnerability. Each additional password increases the risk of weak credentials, password reuse, and unauthorized access. Managing credentials across disparate systems consumes IT resources and complicates compliance. AutoSys solves this with native SAML 2.0 single sign-on support. Whether your teams access AutoSys Web UI through the browser or integrate with REST web services, SAML 2.0 handles authentication seamlessly. Traditionally, AutoSys authentication requires users to enter credentials directly into Web UI. With SAML 2.0 SSO, authentication is delegated to a central identity provider, enabling single sign-on across all enterprise applications. This results in streamlined security, reduced IT overhead, and teams focused on orchestrating critical business processes instead of managing passwords. Prerequisites. Before we begin, ensure you have AutoSys version 24.1 or higher, administrative access to your identity provider, such as Okta or ADFS. For this demo, we use ADFS. EEM is already configured and bound to Active Directory or LDAP. Valid certificates for secure communication between AutoSys and your identity provider. Access to your identity provider's SAML metadata and signing certificate. Privileges in Web UI to modify configuration settings. For this demo, we will show you the IDP and SP configurations using the following applications. ADFS for IDP configurations. AutoSys and CA Embedded Entitlements Manager for service provider configurations. CA-EEM is a centralized security layer for AutoSys that authenticates users and enforces granular access control across workload operations. We will walk through each task to configure and enable SAML single sign-on authentication. The first step in SAML 2 SSO configuration is to generate and export the following certificates between ADFS and CA-EEM. These certificates are useful for encryption and mutual authentication. The token signing certificate in ADFS, the key store and EEM public certificate, the trust store with token signing certificate from ADFS. To configure SAML assertions verification in CA Embedded Entitlements Manager, you'll need to export the token signing certificate from your ADFS server. The CA-EEM uses this ADFS certificate to verify SAML assertions issued by the ADFS server. Let's walk through the process. To generate and export the token signing certificate in ADFS, open the ADFS Management Console on your ADFS server. In the console tree, navigate to Service, then Certificates. In the Details pane, locate the certificate under Token Signing. Right-click the primary token signing certificate, select View Certificate, then navigate to the Details tab and click Copy to File. In the Certificate Export wizard, click Next. Select the format for your certificate. Click Next. Specify the path and file name for exporting the certificate. Then click Next. Click Finish to complete the export. You now have the ADFS token signing certificate. This certificate is used to create the EEM trust store for SAML assertions verification. Now let's generate the key store, public certificate, and trust store on EEM server. When a user requests for access to AutoSys Web UI or REST web services, ADFS uses the public certificate for encryption of SAML assertions so only CA-EEM can decrypt them. CA-EEM uses the trust store for SAML assertions verification and key store for decryption. Before you generate the certificate stores, ensure the Java-enabled key tool utility is installed on the machine on which you want to generate the key store and trust store. A directory is created to store the generated files. The ADFS token signing certificate exported earlier is copied from the ADFS server to the certificate directory on the EEM server. To create EEM key store and export EEM's public certificate, open Command Prompt. Execute the key file command to generate EEM key pair and key store by providing the cryptographic identity information such as the alias, public key password, key store file name and password, and distinguished name that identifies your EEM server. The key tool generates the key store file based on the cryptographic identity information. Now let's create an EEM trust store with ADFS token signing certificate. To create a trust store, execute the key tool command to import the certificate and provide the trust store password. When prompted with "Trust this certificate" by the key tool, type yes to proceed. The key tool creates the trust store. Now execute the key tool to export public certificate of EEM. After exporting the EEM public certificate, copy this file from the EEM server to the ADFS server. This certificate will be used when configuring the relying party trust in ADFS. Next, we register AutoSys Web UI, or the REST Web Services endpoint, as a relying party in ADFS, so that ADFS can issue SAML tokens to AutoSys and exchange SAML messages using the appropriate binding. AutoSys Web UI supports both HTTP post and artifact bindings for SSO, while REST Web Services support HTTP post binding only. In this demo, we will focus on HTTP post binding configuration. A binding defines how SAML messages are carried between AutoSys and ADFS. For example, the full SAML assertion can be sent in the HTTP post body, or a small reference, an artifact, can be sent while the assertion itself is retrieved separately. On the ADFS server, open the ADFS Management Console and start the Add Relying Party Trust wizard. Leave the trust type as Claims Aware, and choose the option to manually enter data for the relying party. Give the relying party a display name, then Continue. Browse and select the token encryption or the public certificate that you generated in EEM for ADFS to send encrypted SAML assertions. On the Configure URL page, enable support for the SAML 2.0 Web SSO protocol and enter the AutoSys Web UI or REST Web Services SAML endpoint. ADFS uses the SSO service URL to send the authentication responses over the configured binding. On the Configure Identifiers page, add AutoSys Web UI Entity ID as the relying party identifier. This value must exactly match the identifier that AutoSys sends in its SAML authentication requests. After the relying party trust is created, open its properties to fine-tune the settings. On the Signature tab, confirm that the correct AutoSys or EEM certificate is selected so ADFS can validate signed requests. On the Endpoints tab, verify the SSO URL and set the binding type to HTTP post, which both Web UI and REST Web Services support. If you are using artifact binding for Web UI, ensure the corresponding artifact endpoint is configured. On the Advanced tab, set the secure hash algorithm to SHA-1 or the algorithm required by your environment. Keep the default access control policy. The access control policy determines who is allowed to authenticate through ADFS and request SAML tokens for AutoSys. By default, it's set to permit everyone, meaning all authenticated Active Directory users can attempt to access AutoSys. Configure the claim rules that tells ADFS which user information to include in the SAML assertion. Click Add Rule and select Send LDAP Attributes as claims from the template drop-down to enable user attributes extraction from Active Directory and convert them to SAML claims. Give the rule a name, set the attribute store to Active Directory, then map SAM account name to name. Click Finish to create the rule. This completes the ADFS configuration for SAML SSO authentication. To ensure ADFS signs both the SAML message and the assertion, verify the SAML response signature property of the relying party trust. Open PowerShell as administrator. Run the following command to check the current setting. If the value is not message and assertion and your EEM configuration requires full message signing, Update it using the following command. If the setting is already message and assertion, no further action is required. The next step is to configure artifact authentication in CA Embedded Entitlements Manager. Log into the CA EEM application and navigate to the Configure tab. Select Artifact Authentication under EEM Server Settings. Provide the key store file location along with its password. Similarly, provide the trust store file location and its corresponding password. Now add a new service provider entry by providing the service provider ID, which uniquely identifies your AutoSys instance to EEM. Enter the relying party identifier. This must exactly match the identifier you configured in ADFS Relying Party Trust. Provide the artifact resolution URL, which is the ADFS endpoint where EEM retrieves SAML assertions. Then specify the assertion attribute that contains the user identifier. Finally, enter the signing key alias. This must match exactly the alias name you specified while generating the key store. This alias tells EEM which private key in the key store to use for signing SAML messages sent to ADFS. Once all fields are configured, save the service provider settings. This completes the artifact authentication configuration in CA Embedded Entitlements Manager. Now let's configure AutoSys to communicate with ADFS using SAML. Log into the AutoSys web UI with administrative credentials and navigate to the configuration interface. In the Preferences section, select Configuration. Expand the Single Sign-On section and select SAML 2 as the single sign-on method. When SAML 2 is selected as the single sign-on method, the Support Non-SSO Login option determines whether the AutoSys login page remains accessible. If this option is enabled, users can access the local login page. If it is disabled, users are redirected directly to SAML SSO and cannot access the login page. Select the binding type as post. The binding type determines how SAML messages are exchanged between AutoSys and ADFS. Post binding sends the full SAML assertion in the HTTP body. Next, enter the Relying Party Trust identifier. This value must exactly match the identifier you configured in ADFS when you created the Relying Party Trust. Then, enter the Service Provider ID. This must exactly match the Service Provider ID you configured in CA-EEM. Any mismatch between these values will cause authentication to fail. Finally, provide the IDP metadata. To obtain the IDP metadata from ADFS, access the following URL in a browser. Replace localhost with your ADFS server hostname or IP address. This URL downloads the Federation Metadata XML file. Navigate to the folder where you downloaded the ADFS Metadata XML file and open it. Copy the Federation Metadata URL, which contains the IDP entity ID, single sign-on URL, and signing certificate, and paste it into the IDP metadata field in AutoSys. Save the configuration. This completes the AutoSys Web UI SAML configuration, enabling secure single sign-on authentication via ADFS. Similarly, we'll configure SAML authentication for AutoSys REST web services. Navigate to the AutoSys installation directory and open the config ACE file. Set the web server authentication mode property to include SAML. Depending on your deployment requirements, this setting can include both basic and SAML, allowing REST clients to authenticate using either method. Set the EEM Service Provider ID property to your Service Provider ID. This must match the ID you configured in CA-EEM and AutoSys Web UI. Save the file, then restart the AutoSys Web Services service from the Services console to apply the changes. This completes SAML configuration for REST web services, enabling secure single sign-on via ADFS. Now let's verify SAML SSO authentication for AutoSys Web UI. Users can now access AutoSys using the following flows. In an IDP-initiated flow, users start their authentication at ADFS and are then redirected to AutoSys. let's demonstrate the IDP-initiated single sign-on. Log into your ADFS server's portal or access the ADFS server's single sign-on page. Select the AutoSys Web UI relying party from the available applications list. Provide your Active Directory username and password when prompted. ADFS authenticates your credentials against Active Directory. Upon successful authentication, ADFS generates a signed SAML assertion containing your user identity and attributes. ADFS automatically redirects you to the AutoSys Web UI. The SAML assertion is transmitted securely in the HTTP post body. AutoSys receives the assertion, validates the digital signature using the ADFS signing certificate in TrustStore, and creates an authenticated session. You are now logged into the AutoSys Web UI without entering any AutoSys-specific credentials. After authentication, user access to AutoSys Web UI components and functions is determined by the roles and permissions configured in the EEM application. In an SP-initiated flow, users are automatically logged into AutoSys Web UI. Navigate to the AutoSys Web UI login page. Remove or bypass login.html from the URL to invoke the SSO flow. This tells AutoSys to initiate SAML authentication instead of Web UI login page. Behind the scenes, AutoSys sends a SAML request to ADFS, and ADFS returns a SAML assertion that logs the user into the Web UI automatically. EEM validates the assertion signature using the TrustStore certificate and creates an authenticated session. You are automatically logged into the AutoSys Web UI without entering any credentials. Similarly, let's verify SAML SSO authentication for REST web services. To verify, you must first obtain a SAML 2.0 token from ADFS by completing a SAML authentication flow. This token contains your authenticated identity and is digitally signed by ADFS. Open a REST client such as Bruno, Postman, or curl to access the AutoSys REST Web Services endpoint. For this demonstration, we'll use Bruno. Provide the REST endpoint URL in your client, then paste the SAML 2.0 token from ADFS into the authorization header as a bearer token. Submit the request. If the request succeeds, an API response is displayed. You have successfully verified SAML SSO authentication for REST web services. Thank you for watching this AutoSys training video.